What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my first impressions of Gears Tactics, a TRPG set in the universe of Gears of War, specifically a prequel technically, as it is 12 years before the events of the first game, and while I admit I am not a diehard Gears of War fan, I do know a fair few things about TRPGs, and this one in particular released back in 2020, I believe, which was a bit before I started doing this full time, so it passed me by a little bit. I have heard from many people over the course of this channel where I cover a lot of these types of games about how good this one is, so it's been on my list to get around to for some time, and thus here we are. So, first impressions wise, I would say Gears Tactics came at me swinging with a few different things. One I would say is pretty positive, and the other one is very negative. We're going to start with the negative simply because it's the first thing you'll see when you log into the game, and I say log in specifically because you have to have an Xbox Live profile, even if you happen to have bought the game on Steam. And that's a nuisance for a few different reasons. For starters, it means that you have to be connected to the internet at least at one point to play this single-player game with no online components. Though you can work around that, it takes a little bit of setup. The Microsoft Store will let you go and designate a device as your offline PC, but you have to do that outside of the game, and it's very unintuitive to do so. And even if you do that, you will still have to be connected to the internet at least briefly to set all that up, which will finally get the game to stop asking you about this every time you load it up. And it will not start otherwise. Now, admittedly, that's not a huge deal other than just being really annoying to me. The main thing I mention this for is because that actually causes a lot of problems with things like the Steam Deck. TRPGs play really well on that platform. But trying to set up the Steam Deck as your offline PC is already going to be incredibly annoying to do, requiring multiple extra steps beyond just a regular PC, which means playing it offline on the go has become vastly more difficult simply with the inclusion of this that serves no purpose. All things like this do is get in the way of putting people in front of your games, and I really want companies to stop doing it. However, once you deal with that scenario, you can actually dive into the game, which is where the more interesting stuff lies, of course. Now, right out of the gate, I would say Gears Tactics is probably going to be fantastic if you like XCOM but didn't like the management side of it. That is to say, all of your troops, research, base management that goes into a game like XCOM. A lot of that has been simplified in favor of very action-oriented, strategy-based combat that, while certainly still having a few management elements, mostly tries to focus on keeping you engaged in the actual battles themselves, which I think isn't a bad thing by any means, as it cuts out a lot of the tedious elements of something like XCOM, so it's already off to a pretty good start. Now, story-wise, this game, as I mentioned, takes place before the official start of the Gears of War franchise as a whole, that is to say Gears 1, and we are playing as Gabe Diaz and a few other people, but he is our primary leader here, who's going to be tracking down and dealing with a big bad guy known as Ukon. Ukon happens to be a geneticist for the Locust Swarms, who is cooking up all sorts of diabolical creations that are finally starting to assault humanity and causing no shortage of problems. So the game revolves simply around recruiting as many people as you can, getting up a squad, and killing this guy. So gameplay-wise, we will deal with a convoy in between missions, which is where we will handle what little management is available, which is basically just opening any reward cases we found while on missions, which will give you access to new mods, recruiting anyone you've saved previously, and then going to the barracks to actually use some of this stuff. In the barracks, you'll get a list of all of your soldiers, where you'll be able to customize their gear a little bit, which means adding mods to their weapons to increase their effectiveness, and also customizing their actual body armor and things, which can have different effects based on what you have equipped as well. There's rarity tiers to all this, so the best stuff will be very impactful and the worst won't. Now, while you're out on missions, you'll be gaining experience for individual soldiers you have, and they can level up, providing them skill points, allowing you to unlock new abilities and things for them. All pretty basic, but where it gets especially fun is the actual combat at play. Now, if you're familiar with these types of games, all of the classics are here, but this is a game that promotes a lot of, I would say, aggressive play, with each of your soldiers here having a different class, which provides them different default skills and abilities alongside weapons. For instance, while you can change this, some of them come with frag grenades or healing grenades, versus a few different types of weapons, which determines exactly what they can do. Now, this is an action point system, as you would almost certainly expect, and while it defaults to 3, there are multiple ways to get extra actions, that is to say executing downed enemies, or using a number of abilities that can provide extra actions as well, allowing you to string together strategic combos to take out the locusts. Now, each of the locust horde enemies has different effects and approaches. For instance, there are small melee-oriented enemies that will attack you whenever you get close, so in theory you want to take them out from range. And then multiple weapons have melee abilities that allow you to one-shot an enemy, but you have to, of course, actually get close, which means breaking out of cover. Though you're probably going to have to get out of cover to some degree to try to flank enemies to increase your chance to hit. The game is pretty good about telling you exactly what affects your chance to hit, which is great. The enemies themselves also use a swarm AI system, that is to say many of the similar smaller enemies all move at the same time to speed up their side of the turns. And then there's your usual stuff like, say, Overwatch abilities, but everyone's sidearm gets a default ability with a decently long cooldown though, called Disrupting Shot, that lets you break up enemy overwatches, and that's just some of the stuff you'll be doing very early on in the game. This game also had a bit of an update early in its life cycle that allows you to get a bunch of new content to the base game via a drone that will follow you around, that can cloak itself, interact with quest objectives, while also buffing up your party with extra accuracy modifiers, though it also introduces new enemy types that buff up the surrounding enemies as well. For instance, the first one I encountered like that reduced your hit chance against everything within range of it. And all of that so far feels great, actually. It's a pretty visceral game. The graphics look fantastic. The maps themselves are relatively small, so you move through them pretty quickly. However, I do have some reservations moving forward to review this thing fully, as is usually the case. For starters, the game is divided up into main missions and side missions. I understand that later on, some of the side missions become mandatory before you can take on the main missions. And the side missions come in a few different categories, like rescue or supply runs, and it seems like there might not be a great deal of variety in what you're actually trying to do in any given mission, which I could see leading to a sense of repetitiveness very quickly. But by and large, from what I've played of this game so far, I would say it seems like a game for when you want something like XCOM that is simply easier to jump into due to the lack of all the management aspects of the game that allow you to simply focus on the combat. So it'll be interesting to see how it shapes up for the review, which is mostly going to come down to what the story or the game mechanics manage to do from here. And while I will have to play through the game a few times, it seems like a pretty straightforward one to approach from a 100% aspect, so hopefully this won't take me longer than a week or so. In the meantime though, let me know what you think about this particular game. I've heard a lot of good things and honestly a few bad ones as well, so I'm curious to know what everyone thinks of it. But that is going to do it for today. So I certainly hope you enjoyed the video. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz, but regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.